Sargent, and on behalf of the family, this includes the children, grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren, I would like to welcome you to this memorial service in honor of Mrs. Marguerite Lary. As a classmate of Ralph's in the class of 1951 and a friend of the family over the years, I was honored when asked to participate in this afternoon ceremony to share reflections of her life. Those of us who knew Marguerite will never forget her many attributes that provide us with pleasant memories of a very special lady. It was Mrs. Lary's wish that this memorial service be a period of joy, as Ralph said earlier today, to me, a celebration. The family has designed today's program towards that end. I would like, however, to take a moment and have you join me in a moment of prayer. Our Father, we thank Thee for Marguerite Lary, her beautiful family, and the many lives she touched are indeed a testimony to the bounty of her life. We ask that you grant her eternal peace, and we ask this in your name. Amen. Before I introduce the first of our speakers this afternoon, I have to tell you just two quick stories. 3 or 4 years ago, I was visiting with Mrs. Lary for a few moments at the Thurston residence, and she was dressed to the nines as usual. After we exchanged our how-do-you-dos and our pleasantries and how nice everything was, she promptly reminded me that my only problem was I didn't study. And that was 45 years ago. It took me back a peg, I will tell you that. She was a teacher to the very end. As we all know, she loved her profession. And just a few weeks ago when I went up to visit with her daughter Jocelyn and the family, and we were discussing some of the things for today's program, Jocelyn says, if you haven't been, watch this video. It's very quick. And it was taken not long before Mrs. Lary passed away. There was Mrs. Lary in a nursing home in Frederick, Maryland, not a hair out of place, clean, fresh bathrobe, sitting down, leaning forward in her best teaching style. She was telling the story of a hayride she took as a youngster, and they had corn and candy and how thrilled she was. And she was telling this to a group of her resident nursing home friends. One old gentleman closed his eyes, and his head went down, and I said, uh-oh. Her voice went up a few decibels, and she said, Herbert! His head came up, his arms went back, his eyes opened wide, and I said, oh. She continued on to the story without missing a heartbeat. And that brought back a few memories, and Ralph and I can assure you we had nobody in our class who caused instances like that. But it was amazing to know that 95 years old, and she was still through and through that person, that teacher, and caring, and really, it's amazing to me that at that age. And we're very fortunate to have had Mrs. Lary that long, and I think the family is too. I would like to introduce our first speaker today. He is a former student of Mrs. Lary's, and he's also the former superintendent of Cape Elizabeth Schools, and a practicing psychologist, Dr. Bruce Phillip. Bruce, would you come up, please?
Thank you, Courtney. I was also honored to come this afternoon and to speak to you folks about Mrs. Lary, my Lary. I'd like to do that. As I speak, I'm really speaking for all of us, I hope. So even though I'm going to personalize my stories, you all in your heads have your own stories that you could recall and could tell as equally as any of us. So please bear with me for a minute while I recount what happened to me and Mrs. Lary, and see if this somehow is what happened to you. And as Courtney told us earlier, she wanted celebrations, so I'm going to talk about some things that happened along the way. First, one of the things that did happen to me. I was in 11th grade in what was Scarborough High School before the addition was put on. And in those days, Mrs. Lary, as always, had high standards for everybody. She came in and she read what a 12th grader had done. And we're supposed to, as 11th graders, meet that standard. I learned later that my wife, Peggy, had written that article. What I decided to do at that moment was maybe date her and later on marry her. It was easier. One other thing that Mrs. Lary did that I liked a lot, because it changed my life forever. I was walking down the halls of Scarborough High School one day. Unknown to me, Dr. Beale at Durham State Teachers College was coming in to recruit young men to go into teaching. Well, men going into teaching was like, it never happened. She put her arm around me and said, "Bruce, come with me." She walked me up to Lakewood Hall, and I met for the first time Dr. Bailey, who talked about teaching. That life-changing few minutes of time that Miss Lary invested in me was wonderful for me, and I think wonderful for my family. What happened also that day was not only the symbolism of me going to teaching, but the symbolism of somebody who cared about me. It's one thing, and it's very nice to have parents, grandparents who care for you, but to have a teacher care for you. Wow, you never heard of that. That was very different. That was wonderful. And to this day, that's one of my fondest memories. You know, it changed my life. It sent me off to college, a college at which time I didn't have to do a whole lot of studying. Mrs. Lary had instructed me so well that I didn't have to study any English literature. I didn't have to study any or much algebra, because that was her favorite love, as you may remember, sitting in her class. So whether it be algebra or English, whether it's the Battle of Avon or factoring, it didn't make any difference. She could do it. She did it all. It was wonderful to have that personalized feeling from someone who was your teacher. A third thing she did for me, and a group of us, was we could go up to her house at any time if we ran into a problem. One summer, we went up to her house. There were 3 or 4 of us who had some difficulty. It took her maybe a couple of days to straighten that difficulty out. There was no talk of money. There was just talk about working harder. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, working harder. Trying to figure out something for yourself. Here's an idea, go with that idea. A third thing that Mrs. Lary did that was very helpful to me, she would often use a voice like Courtney said earlier, but only if it was demanded of her. Quite often, her voice was gentle. And you remember that? Quite often, not only was it gentle, but it was caring. And quite often in that caring, there was that physical touch. Today, we can't touch kids in the same way that she could touch kids. We can't do things that used to be done in Scarborough High School. You can't bring your gun, you can't bring your dog, you can't go hunting. We were just talking about that a little while ago, as we used to do in the old days. In the old days, it was a little different, and teachers were a little different. Mrs. Lary she was a 90 woman before the 90s were invented. Here she was, a mother, a wife of her first select man, and a teacher. My God, she was there for years. And she had this caring attitude. Let me tell you one other anecdote about her that helped me a lot. Because I put my glasses on. I didn't have those in her class. Oh yes, one thing I wanted to make sure I said today is not only was she caring, like the story you mentioned, going up to her house for tutoring, like seeing Dr. Bailey for the first time, but she was also one of these people that I would see outside of school. I would often see her at Pine Point Beach, bathing, going in the water. I would oftentimes see her at a store, and my brother-in-law, Mickey, often took her for groceries on Fridays. As a matter of fact, I think that's where he passed English. I think. But he was very indebted to her, as all of us have been indebted to her. Seeing her at seeing her at, do you remember Mary and Bob's? Oh yeah. Do you remember we would have balls in the high school? She and Mrs. Libby would put those together. Do you remember those? Sure, of course you do. Do you remember the canteens? all sponsored by citizens of the town or by some of the teachers in town because they cared about the kids in town. The auditorium that we're sitting in today, the auditorium from which I'm speaking, is because we care about the kids in town. It's so nice to have an opportunity to carry on some traditions that were started by the faculty members here at Scarborough High School some years ago. I will never forget, nor shall I ever forget, a person like Mrs. Lary. I would like to close by offering something to her and to you to think about. For me, she represented something that research has said. Research has said that all of us need models in our lives. We need someone to look up to. We need sometimes someone outside of our family to look up to. So the wow of a teacher comes back to me. Mrs. Lary is one of those persons for me. The idea of teaching, the idea of being with young people came from her and has stayed with me for these many years. So Mrs. Lary, I say this to you. Not only are my model, but I would like to quote a little bit, not much, just a little bit, from Ben Jonson, one of the poets that she taught me about. As I said earlier, I could go off to college and study poetry, but I was so far ahead because Miss Lary made sure that her students understood it. From Ben Jonson to Mrs. Lary, I paraphrased. Queen, you are so fair. Now the sun has laid you to sleep. Stay in your silver chair, for your goodness is excellent and will always be remembered. Thank you. Thank you, Courtney.
Our second speaker is Mr. Al Junowitz, former principal of Scarborough High School. Al?
My relationship with Marguerite Lary was as a co-worker and certainly one of the most outstanding educators I've ever had the privilege to know. To have had the opportunity to share such a dynamic, caring, and intelligent life as was Marguerite Lary's is a privilege indeed. In addition to being highly dynamic, caring, and intelligent, Marguerite had something else which is very special in my mind. Marguerite Lary was a believer. She believed in her husband Leon. She believed in her children. She believed in her community. She believed in her faith. And she believed in her students, part of what Bruce was attesting to. There are far too many examples of her positive impact on her students to relate anywhere near all of them here this afternoon. But just a couple of instances or situations which sort of summarize for me her work here at Scarborough High School. Many were the times that I would overhear students emphasizing to each other the urgency to complete some major assignment, the deadline for which was fast approaching. And the class that so many times seemed to carry the greatest urgency was Mrs. Lary's. Oh yes, they would sometimes, in the midst of their dissertations amongst themselves, indicate that it was a fear of wrath that gave such priority, but in most cases, it was primarily their respect for this teacher that motivated them. A teacher who believed in them, respected them, and gave her all for them. All students, regardless of their motivation or aptitude for academics, at the time that they were in her class, received the same respect and expectation to accomplish at their own individual ability. Oh yes, this carried over to the plays, the clubs, and the trips that she advised and directed. How many Scarborough High School students who were convinced themselves that they could never perform a part in a play on stage found themselves in that magical event doing exactly that and gaining a measure of self-confidence, many over the years, as you people know. It was Marguerite Lary's gift to so many, raising their belief in themselves and their respect for others. This person of many talents and intellect could have been successful at so many professions. Aren't we fortunate that she chose the professions of mother, wife, and teacher? Marguerite, your good life and your good work continue to shine. And I'm sure that they will continue to do so in the many years ahead.
It is my privilege at this time to introduce to you Mrs. Lary's oldest great-grandchild, and her name is Erin Allen. Erin, and her middle name is Marguerite, incidentally, so Erin, Marguerite, would you please come up? Thank you.
I'm Erin Marguerite Hallen, and as my great-grandmother's namesake, as well as the oldest great-grandchild, I'll be speaking on behalf of all of her 9 great-grandchildren. Being the oldest, I was able to spend the most time with Grandma, and in turn was probably the most spoiled by her love of spending money. Shopping with Grandma was the greatest. When Mom said no, I could always turn to Grandma no matter how odd, useless, or hideous the object of my desire was. And what was a shopping trip or any other outing for that matter without a picture? Go to the store, get a picture with the cashier. Go out to eat, get a picture with the hostess, the waitress, and even the busboy. And on and on and on. But there were so many other great things about Grandma too. Despite the fact that she'd been retired for a number of years before I came along, the teacher side of her remained ever present. When she'd call my house, to wish me happy birthday or whatever, one of the first things out of her mouth was, "How are you doing in school?" "Fine, Grandma." "You keeping your grades up?" "Yes, Grandma." "So how are your activities? You still in the drama group?" "Yes, Grandma." Grandma always had a way of getting me to do things. There was a time back when I was in middle school when I wasn't doing too well with my grades, and I was just starting to get all psyched up to go through my rebellious stage. But of course, after a visit, as well as a lengthy lecture from Grandma, my grades, had to go back up, and all my dreams of becoming the crazy teenager were crushed. But the last thing you want to do is tell Grandma something she doesn't want to hear. But you also can't really lie to her either, so for that reason, my grades have stayed up ever since. But no matter if times were good or bad, there was always a Benji Bear story to go along with it. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Benji Bear, he's the bear, fictional one of course, that's been with our family for a couple generations now, and he's the main character of a lot of Grandma's stories that she used to tell us. So I thought it'd be appropriate to end with the final Benji Bear story about her great-grandchildren carrying on her legacy into the 21st century. Now, keep in mind that for Grandma, nothing was just ordinary. So it's entitled Benji's Greatest Mission, and the year is 2030. One day, as Benji was walking through the woods of Scarborough, he thought to himself, "I haven't seen the great-grandchildren lately. I wonder how they're doing." Coincidentally, the angel Marguerite happened to be looking down upon him. "Benji," she said, "how funny you should say that. I was just about to ask you to do me a favor. You see, I've been really busy lately with my pictures and the bridge club that I haven't got much time to check up on my great-grandchildren. I was wondering if you might be able to see what they've been up to." "Sure, Grandma," Benji said. "I'd love to." So Benji went off to embark upon what would be his greatest mission. The beginning of his journey took him just across the border up north to Canada, where he found Matthew, a professional hockey player in the NHL, using his $20 million a year salary to support his parents in their retirement. The next leg of Benji's journey took him back to the U.S. in New Hampshire, where he found Lauren, a professional horseback rider trotting around the grounds of her $6.5 million estate. She she directed Benji down to Florida, where he found Taylor, who had just won the Daytona 500. She wasn't able to visit Benji much, though, because she was off to Paris, where she held a modeling job on the side. But she did have enough time to tell Benji to go over to Colorado, where he would find Tyler. Well, Tyler had just returned from South America, where his soccer team had defeated Brazil to win the World Cup. And he was now hitting the slopes to begin his ski training for the upcoming Olympics. Benji then went down to California, where he found Greg, managing his own multi-billion-dollar record label, and Leon, as a molecular engineer who had discovered a way to run the entire world solely on solar energy. After a short visit, Benji was off again. But this time his mission took him across the Pacific to Beijing, where he found Ross, serving as the American ambassador to China. 7 grandchildren down, 2 to go. Ross told Benji that to find the last 2 great-grandchildren, he'd have to go back to the U.S. and to our nation's capital. So once he reached Washington, D.C., he immediately ran into Sophie. She had just been sworn in as the youngest Supreme Court Justice at the age of 33. "Well," Benji exclaimed, "I never dreamed that the great-grandchildren would turn out so wonderfully. I can't wait to report back to Marguerite, but I just can't seem to find Erin. Do you know where she lives?" Benji asked Sophie. "Oh yeah, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue." Sophie replied. "Oh, well, I'm not too familiar with this area," Benji said. Could you tell me, a little bit more directions?" "Oh, yeah, you just go down the road. It's that big white house on your left. Can't miss it." So, sure enough, Benji came upon a big white house, where inside lived Erin, who had just been re-elected to serve her 2nd term as the first female president. Well, needless to say, Marguerite was thrilled when she heard all the success of her great-grandchildren. But what else would she expect? After all, we are the great-grandchildren of the best grandmother, teacher, and all-around lady that ever lived. And it is our duty, as her heir, to ensure that in her memory goes on forever and ever, and her legacy is never forgotten. Now, before we finish, Grandma would never ever forgive me if I didn't take advantage of this opportunity, so... Smile, everybody! Well, I guess that'd be good. There you go. Thank you.
After listening to Erin, I think we can all rest assured this may be a memorial service for Mrs. Lary. Mrs. Lary never left. She would have been proud of that, very proud of that. I have a letter here. It's written to family and friends. I would like to read it this time. Excuse me for making this noise. And we're going to read this, and then we're going to have a brief video of some of the highlights of Mrs. Lary's life. I have not seen the video, only Jocelyn has seen it. So before I do that, I would like to take this opportunity on behalf of Jocelyn, Ralph, the family, and myself, and thank Roberta Thurston of Blackington for being of so much assistance, putting something together like this from 600 or 700 miles away, and telephone conversations. She really has been a tremendous help to us, and we all appreciate it. Thank you for that, Roberta. This letter is dated July 5th, 1998. It says, "Dear friends, as you gather to honor the memory of Marguerite Lary, and I want to add my condolences to her family, as well as my appreciation for her extraordinary half-century in the teaching profession. During the course of her remarkable 43 years tenure at Scarborough High School, Marguerite made a difference in the lives of countless Scarborough students. There can be no more noble a profession than education, and it is because of special teachers like Marguerite that so many students go on to lead successful, fulfilling lives. Whether as a drama coach or head of the English department, Marguerite helped stimulate young minds and promote learning that will last a lifetime. And she was the quintessential 20th century woman, successfully juggling her profession and her family, giving them both her all. Her devotion to her family was evidenced to us all when in 1978 she was recognized as Maine's Mother of the Year. This memorial service is a most appropriate way to celebrate the life and contributions of a wonderful woman. And I am pleased to be able to express my condolences as well as my more sincere appreciation for the legacy she has left. Sincerely, Olympia Snow, United States Senate. We ready with the video?
spent her last days in a retirement home in Frederick, Maryland, but her first days were clear in her memory.
My mother never drove, but she did drive horses. She did drive, and so we traveled the old-fashioned way, and my first car was going with my mother with a crowd of children, a wagon with hay, and riding over the countryside and thinking it was marvelous.
Marguerite Lary's first days were in Verona, New Jersey, where she was born in 1902, born into a world filled with music. Her parents, Joella and Charles Rice, were both accomplished musicians, and their first three children traveled the country, performing on stages at very early ages. Marguerite was the last born of five, and although she yearned to play the cello and travel like her siblings, her parents decided she should have a more normal life, go to real school, not homeschool, and then on to college. She attended Colby College in Maine and Columbia and Barnard in New York, and graduated and swept off to be a teacher. In 1930, she learned of a small high school in Scarborough, Maine, contacted Principal Elwood G. Bessie, and was hired. Now, Bessie was the principal 9 years earlier as well, when the senior class president was a young man named Leon Lary, the same Leon Lary who was working in his family's farm field one day when Marguerite passed by with a friend. She turned to her friend, pointed at Leon, and said, "That's the man I'm going to marry." She did in 1933, moving into the Lary homestead and raising their three children in the small farming community. Marguerite, who had dreamed of a life in music for herself, dreamed the same dream for her children, Ralph, Edmund, and Jocelyn. But she found that the gift had skipped a generation, and ever the teacher, she helped them find and develop their own talents. And after baby Jocelyn was old enough for school, Marguerite returned full-time to help others find and develop their own talents. She returned to Scarborough High School, where she would stay until 1972, 42 years in the same school, teaching students, and then the children of those students, and then the grandchildren of those students. Their personal lives were as important to her as their academic lives, their basketball scores as their vocabulary scores. But she was a tough teacher. Her own children had to call her Mrs. Lary in school. She loved her students, but she challenged them, often with a poem. Heights by great men reached and kept were seldom gained in sudden flight, but they, while their companions slept, were toiling upward in the night. Marguerite could cajole, she could understand, she could enjoy, but she could not be bamboozled. She taught her students in class, in small groups, and one-on-one. She cheered at the games, she chaperoned the dances, and she directed the plays. The lives of her students became part of the life of Marguerite Lary. And even after they left, they came back, and she was still there, still caring. And while she was a full-time teacher, she was a full-time wife and a full-time mother, and now grandmother. Her own children's children spent every 4th of July on a grandchildren's weekend, taking beach trips, working on projects, playing games, picking blueberries, eating lobsters and muffins, and Foley's ice cream. And then in 1972, at the age of 70, she had to retire from the public schools, but she continued to mold the minds of young people at the nearby private Macaulay School. Her world changed dramatically, though, in 1976, when Leon Lary, her husband of 43 years, died. But her life continued with vigor. She was named Maine's Mother of the Year in 1978. She traveled, sometimes any way she could. She carried a camera and took pictures, never of things or places, but always of people and moments in their lives. She wintered in a retirement community in Florida, urging seniors to seize the day, and for her zest and her gusto, she was crowned Queen of the Park. Eventually, she moved to a nursing home in Frederick, Maryland. And if Marguerite Lary's first car was a hay wagon, her last car was a chair with wheels, which she drove down the halls of the home, taking pictures, greeting nurses, reaching out to the lonely and the confused, and teaching, always teaching, working with residents to exercise their minds. And she did it all with a playful sense of the joy of life. She was surrounded by those she loved and those who loved her to the very end. And to the very end, she was filled with the memories of her life in Scarborough. Her family, her friends, her students, her school, and her community were her world. And she loved her world. And it was wonderful.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue and clouds of white, the bright blessed day, dark sacred night. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. I hear babies cry. I watch them grow. They learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Oh, yes.
The youngest Ralph Lary. Well, actually not the youngest. My son's the youngest. But I want to thank you for what you said. That
Thank you so much.
really great.
Doing stuff for her, so yeah. You all made her famous in our lives. Hi there. How you doing? Oh, I know. Get out there. It was nice, wasn't it?
Nice to meet you guys. You can come back.
Did he?
Your name first.
skirt.
How you doing? Hi, Pac. Got it.
Good to see you.
Good to see you, Pac.
That's why we take one of your mother.